Before Judge Alaric Fenro lost his bench, before 11 families stood inside the courthouse and named the acres stolen from them, before the territorial examiner unfolded the deed that ruined the most respected man in Absolution Creek, there was only a poor washerwoman chasing a goose through the dust. Elspeth Rayner did not look like justice that morning. She looked tired. Her sleeves were wet from the wash tubs, her boots had split at the toes, and her gray-brown hair had slipped loose beneath a faded scarf. The goose, waddling ahead of her, looked no better. Martha had one white clouded eye, a crooked foot, and a temper sharp enough to make grown men step aside when she turned her beak left. The town saw a nuisance. Judge Fenro saw trouble. He stepped from the courthouse, just as Martha reached the locked back entrance. His face remained calm, but his hand tightened around the brass head of his cane. "Take that animal away from here," he said. "This door has been closed long enough." Elspeth froze, not because of his anger. She froze because of the word closed. It sounded less like an order and more like a warning. She bent to gather Martha up, ready to carry the old goose back toward the creek and swallow one more morning of laughter. But Martha lowered her body and scraped beneath the threshold with a stubbornness that made her breath rattle. Once, twice, again, until the old wood cracked dryly. Something small rolled into the sunlight. Not gold, not a coin, not anything a poor woman could sell. It was a lump of blue sealing wax, hardened around the torn corner of a laundry tag, stitched with Nell Rayner's initials. Nell, Elspeth's younger sister, who had vanished after washing courthouse linens 12 years ago. And beneath the wax was the mark of a court seal. Everyone in Absolution Creek had been told no longer existed. Elspeth closed her fingers around the wax before anyone else could step near it. The lump was no larger than the end of her thumb, but it felt heavier than wet linen in winter. Blue sealing wax did not belong under a courthouse threshold. A laundry tag with Nell's initials did not belong there either. For a moment, the whole street seemed to hold its breath around her. From the men at the hitching rail to the women standing beneath their parasols. From the deputy rubbing his bitten wrist to Judge Fenro above them with his cane pressed hard against the stone. Marshal Cale Braddock came down first. He was a square-built man with sunburned cheeks and a gray mustache that made every word look more official than it was. "Hand that over, Mrs. Rayner," he said. "If it came from county property, it belongs to the county." Elspeth did not move. In 30 years of washing for Absolution Creek, she had learned that poor hands were always accused of holding something wrong. If she carried sheets, someone counted them twice. If she brought back a shirt with a missing button, someone assumed she had sold it. If she spoke too sharply, folks called it bitterness. If she stayed quiet, they called it guilt. But this was not a shirt button or a lost collar stud. This was Nell's stitchwork, tiny and slanted, the way her sister had sewn every tag, because her right hand had never steadied after a childhood fever. Martha stood beside Elspeth's boot, chest heaving, cloudy eye fixed on the broken seam beneath the door. The old goose had gone still now, which frightened Elspeth more than the biting ever had. Martha was never still, unless she was listening to something no one else could hear. Judge Fenro descended only 2 steps. He did not hurry. Men like him never hurried in public. They let the room come to them even when there was no room, only dust and noon heat. "Marshal," he said mildly, "there is no need to make a spectacle of Mrs. Rayner. She has had a hard life, and grief gives old objects more meaning than they deserve." A few people nodded because it was easier to agree with clean words than dirty evidence. Reverend Amos Lyle, broad-bellied and silver-haired, touched the front of his black coat and murmured, "Mercy is often best shown by ending confusion early." Elspeth looked at him and remembered the judge's pew in church, polished every Sunday, paid for with donations no one questioned. Then she looked at the wax again. The edge of the seal mark was broken, but the curve was there, and inside it the faint rise of a letter. Not the new court seal stamped on notices now. She had seen that one often enough on unpaid washing bills and tax warnings. This mark was older, deeper, made with a heavier press. "Nell washed courthouse linens the week she vanished," Elspeth said. The words came out thin, and the crowd shifted at the sound of the dead girl's name. 12 years had turned Nell Rayner into something Absolution Creek preferred, softened. Poor Nell, sickly Nell, foolish Nell, who must have run somewhere or fallen somewhere or done something no decent person wished to describe. Elspeth had been told every version except the one that gave her sister courage. Judge Fenro's expression did not change. Your sister's passing was a sorrow to us all. She did not pass, Elspeth said. People pass in beds. Nell disappeared after carrying your linens back through that door. The marshal glanced toward the locked entrance. That door has not been used in years. Martha gave a low, rough hiss. Several men laughed, but softer now. The goose's crooked foot trembled from the strain of the climb, and a smear of dust clung to the pale feathers under her breast. Elspeth wanted to pick her up, tuck her under one arm, and leave before the town found a new way to shame them both. She had rent due in 6 days on the 2-room shack by Mercy Creek. She owed $9.40 to Pritchard's store. Judge Fenro had signed 3 foreclosure orders that morning alone, and one careless word from him could make every paying customer in town decide their sheets were cleaner elsewhere. That was how Absolution Creek kept people obedient, not always with guns, mostly with ledgers, whispers, and doors that closed before poor women reached them. Mrs. Rayner, Fenro said, still gentle, keep the wax if it comforts you, but do not mistake a scrap for proof. County records are not reopened because a barnyard bird scratches at rotten wood. At that, Martha moved. She lowered her head, not toward the wax, but toward Elspeth's apron pocket where the laundry tag rested against her palm. Then the goose turned back to the threshold and struck once, hard, not at the broken place, but at a nail head, half hidden under gray dust. The nail rang strangely, not dull like wood. Hollow. Elspeth heard it. So did Marshal Braddock. His eyes narrowed before he could stop them. Judge Fenro saw the marshal hear it, and for the first time, his polished calm tightened at the mouth. Elspeth knelt slowly. Beneath the nailhead, just visible where Martha's beak had scraped away the dust, was a thin line cut into the step. Not a crack from age, not rot. A seam, straight as a ruler, running under the locked courthouse door. Marshal Braddock crouched before the threshold, though he did it with the reluctance of a man who knew every eye in town would remember which knee touched the dust. He took off one glove and brushed the scraped place with his thumb. The seam did not crumble like rot. It held clean and straight under the powder of old dirt, running from the nail Martha had struck toward the shadow beneath the locked door. A second nail sat 3 inches away, driven too deep, its head dark with age, but not rusted through. Braddock tapped it with the back of his pocket knife, and the step answered with that same thin, hollow note. Judge Fenro gave a small sigh. Marshal, I would prefer you not damage county property because Mrs. Rayner's goose has made a commotion. I am not damaging it, Braddock said. No, the judge replied, voice mild enough to make the correction sound courteous. But you are encouraging a crowd to believe there is something official in a bird's scratching. The crowd liked that sentence. It gave them permission to breathe again. A few men near the rail chuckled. Someone muttered that Elspeth ought to boil the goose before it brought a fine down on her head. Martha shifted closer to Elspeth's skirt, her old foot trembling, but she did not retreat. Dust clung to the damp feathers under her breast, and every breath came with a faint scrape, as if the climb from Mercy Creek had taken more from her than she meant to show. Elspeth heard the breathing and nearly gave in. She could carry Martha home, set her in the shade by the wash shed, and pretend the wax in her pocket was only another cruelty the world had dropped into her hand. But the seam under the door had not been made by weather, and Judge Fenro had looked at it too quickly before looking away. Who cut that step? Elspeth asked. The question was small. In the courthouse yard, it landed like a thrown stone. Fenro turned his face toward her with practiced patience. Repairs are made to public buildings every year, Mrs. Rayner. I do not keep a personal memory of every plank. You remembered the door was closed. Because it has been closed. Why? The judge's hand tightened again on the cane, only for a breath. Because that entrance leads to storage, and storage is not a place for idle citizens. Reverend Lyle nodded, as if storage itself were a moral argument. Some doors are closed for order. The poor suffer most when order is mocked. Elspeth looked past him to the back entrance. Above the door, a strip of sun-faded paint marked where an old sign had once hung. She remembered Nell laughing about that sign because one corner had dropped loose and tapped the wall whenever the wind came east. Court deliveries, it had said. Laundry, coal oil, paper, sealing wax, and all the small things that kept official men clean. Nell had gone through that entrance every Tuesday and Friday, with folded linen pressed to her chest. A dry voice came from behind the judge. That step was changed in the spring of '74. Everyone turned. Silas Broom, the court clerk, stood in the side doorway, with an ink rag twisted between both hands. He was a narrow man in his 60s, with spectacles too large for his face and shoulders bent from 30 years of leaning over county books. His mouth had opened before his courage was ready. When he saw Fenro looking at him, his jaw trembled. "The storm that spring," Silas added quickly. "Water under the back sill. I believe that was the reason." Judge Fenro smiled without warmth. "Thank you, Mr. Broom. As you hear, Mrs. Rayner, ordinary maintenance." Braddock rose halfway. "Spring of '74 was when the old seal went missing." The marshal said it before thinking, and silence folded around the words. Elspeth felt the wax against her palm as if it had warmed there. 12 years had passed, but some dates had iron hooks. Nell vanished in April of '74. The court seal was replaced in May. By June, Judge Fenro had signed the first of the foreclosure orders that took the north grazing strips from 3 families who could not read the filings they were told to trust. Silas Broom lowered his eyes. Fenro did not. The seal was misplaced during a period of clerical disorder. It was reported, replaced, and recorded properly. There is nothing mysterious in an office losing a tool. "Then why is its mark under your back door?" Elspeth asked. A woman near the hitching rail drew in a sharp breath. Elspeth recognized her then. Hattie Crowell, black bonnet faded brown at the edges, hands clenched over the handle of a market basket. Hattie's 40 acres were being called for sale that afternoon because a fee had appeared on a deed her dead husband swore he paid. She had not spoken against the court. Nobody did. Not when the court was the place that wrote down whether your grief owned a roof or not. Judge Fenro's gaze moved from Hattie back to Elspeth. "I have indulged this long enough. If you wish to accuse the county, you may file a written petition with a $2 fee and 2 witnesses of standing. Until then, I will not have proceedings delayed by riverbank superstition." $2. Elspeth thought of the $9.40 she owed Pritchard, the rent due in 6 days, the cracked kettle handle she had tied with wire, because a new one cost 20 cents. Law always sounded cleanest when it named a price poor people could not pay. Marshal Braddock closed his knife, but did not step away from the threshold. "Judge, I would like to have the carpenter look at this seam after court." Fenro's smile thinned. "The carpenter answers to county authorization. I will decide what county property requires. And if there is something under it, then it will still be under it tomorrow." The judge turned to the crowd. "Court will resume in 10 minutes. Anyone remaining at this door after that will be considered disorderly." The threat worked because it was not shouted. Men drifted first, then women, then those who wanted to say they had seen nothing worth retelling. Hattie Crowell lingered, but Reverend Lyle touched her elbow and guided her away with a kindness that looked too much like pressure. Silas Broom backed into the side doorway, still twisting the ink rag, and for 1 second his eyes met Elspeth's. They were wet with fear, not guilt alone. That difference mattered, though she did not yet know why. Elspeth waited until Fenro climbed the courthouse steps and disappeared through the front entrance. Only Marshal Braddock remained close enough to stop her, and even he looked torn between his badge and the hollow sound he had heard. "Go home, Mrs. Rayner," he said quietly. "Not because he is right, because he is watching." Elspeth gathered Martha at last. The goose was heavier than she looked, all bone and stubborn heat beneath dirty feathers. Elspeth had taken 3 steps toward the yard when Martha jerked so hard she almost fell from Elspeth's arms. Her long neck stretched toward the threshold, not at the seam now, but at the narrow gap where the lower hinge met the frame. "Martha." "No." The old goose answered with a ragged hiss, kicked free, and landed badly on her crooked foot. Pain shivered through her body, yet she pushed forward before Elspeth could catch her. Braddock swore under his breath but did not move fast enough. Martha drove her beak into the hinge gap and pulled. For a moment, nothing came. Then a pale strip slid out, inch by inch, stiff with dust, and caught on a splinter. Elspeth knelt and took it before Martha tore it in half. It was not paper. It was linen tape, the kind Nell had sewn into courthouse bundles so they would come back to the washyard sorted and counted. 3 tiny stitches crossed one end in dark thread, Nell's private mark for a delivery missing 1 piece. On the other end, half buried under grime, were 2 words written in faded laundry ink. "Back room." Marshal Braddock saw the words before Elspeth could close her hand. "Back room," written in Nell's faded laundry ink, looked too small to trouble a courthouse, but it changed the marshal's face. He glanced toward the front steps, then toward the thinning crowd as if any open window might have ears. "Put that away," he said. Elspeth folded the linen strip into her palm. "You asked for county property once already. That was before I saw your sister's hand on it." Braddock lowered his voice. If Fenro sees it now, he will call it stolen evidence, nuisance evidence, anything that lets him take it before you know what it means. Then you heard the hollow step too. I heard a noise, he said, not meeting her eyes. I also heard a judge tell the town he would punish disorder. One gets remembered, the other gets enforced. Martha leaned against Elspeth's skirt, breathing hard through her open beak. The old goose's leg had begun to shake again, a tiny tremor running from crooked foot to gray breast. Elspeth tucked the linen strip deep inside the inner fold of her apron, where wet cloth had hidden coins and receipts for half her life. She carried Martha home by alleys instead of Main Street. Absolution Creek had clean boardwalks in front of the bank and courthouse, wagon ruts where merchants cursed mud on their wheels, and narrow back lanes where washerwomen, draymen, stable boys, and kitchen girls moved the town's dirt without being counted as part of town. Elspeth took the third kind. Martha did not fight her this time. The goose's head lay heavy against her arm. But whenever the courthouse roof showed between buildings, Martha lifted her cloudy eye and made a low sound. The wash yard behind Elspeth's shack smelled of lye, creek water, and sun-struck cotton. 2 iron kettles sat over dead coals. Linen sheets hung in pale lines between willow posts, snapping in the dry wind like surrender flags. Nell had strung the first line herself when she was 17, laughing that poor women needed at least one thing in the world to stand straight. Elspeth had not moved it after her sister vanished. Inside the shack, Martha settled beneath the table but did not sleep. Elspeth set the blue wax, the tag corner, and the back room tape on an overturned pie tin. The 3 pieces looked foolish there, too small and dirty to carry 12 years of silence. Then Martha stretched her neck toward the narrow shelf above the stove, where Elspeth kept old account books wrapped in flour cloth. No, Elspeth murmured. You do not get to know that too. Martha clicked her beak softly. Elspeth took down the oldest ledger. The cover had warped from damp, and the first pages smelled of smoke from the winter the chimney cracked. She had kept laundry accounts since before she could afford ink every week, because rich people forgot debts faster than poor people could afford to forgive them. Nell's hand appeared through the book, like a second voice. Courthouse bundles, kitchen linens, judge's towels, clerk's cuffs, delivery day, return count, missing items. The 7th of April, 1874. Courthouse bundle, delivered by Nell through back entrance. 12 towels, 6 tablecloths, 3 chamber cloths, 1 green striped napkin, returned short, 1 chamber cloth. April 10, Judge's Chambers. 4 shirts, 2 collars, 3 hand towels, 1 blue ribbon tie from clerk's room, returned short, 1 collar. April 14, court delivery delayed. Nell returned after dark. Marked wax on cuff, said not to charge. Elspeth read that line 3 times. Some memories hid not because they were gone, but because grief stacked heavier things on top of them. Nell had come home late that night, with her face pale and her sleeve turned inward. Elspeth had scolded her for losing a collar, because they could not afford another complaint. Nell had said, "It is only a collar, Els." Then she had fed Martha from her hand, and sat awake long after the lamp burned low. Martha nudged the table leg with her beak. Elspeth turned the page. April 17 had a black thumbprint smeared over the courthouse line. No return count. No charge collected. Beside it, Nell had drawn 3 tiny stitches, the same private mark sewn on the back room tape. Under that mark, in lettering so small Elspeth had to carry the page to the window, were 2 initials, J.T. Jonah Teague. The name brought a different smell into the room. Wagon grease, horse sweat, tobacco leaf, and rain, soaked canvas. Jonah was the courthouse drayman, a broad-backed man with one shoulder lower than the other from years of lifting crates. He had delivered coal oil to the judge, hauled old files to storage, and carried sealed trunks from the back entrance the spring Nell vanished. He also had keys to half the service doors in Absolution Creek, because clean men did not like to wait for dirty work. Elspeth closed the ledger, then opened it again, because fear often made a person foolish enough to stop reading. On April 18, the day after Nell's last marked delivery, the handwriting changed. Nell missing. Sheriff says wait. Courthouse denies receiving linens. Judge paid $2 for lost bundle without being asked. Paid in silver. She touched the line with one finger. Judge Fenro had paid for lost linens without argument. That had felt like mercy then. Now it felt like a door closing. A knock struck the front frame. Martha lifted herself with a pained grunt and snapped her beak at the air. Elspeth slid the ledger beneath the flour sack beside the stove, swept the wax pieces into her apron, and opened the door only as wide as her shoulder. Hattie Kroll stood outside with her market basket held against her chest. Up close, the widow looked older than she had in the courthouse yard. Dust had settled into the creases around her mouth, and one glove had been mended with thread the wrong shade of black. "I should not be here," Hattie said. "Then you best come in before someone sees you deciding." Hattie entered, eyes dropping first to Martha, then to the shelf, where ledgers had left a clean mark in dust. "My Isaac always said the court record was wrong. He said he paid the filing fee in '74 when we added the north pasture. After he died, the clerk said there was no proof. Judge Fenro said grief made Isaac misremember. I believed the judge, because believing him cost less than fighting him." She pulled a folded deed from the basket. The paper had been handled so often the creases were soft as cloth. Elspeth did not understand all the language, but she understood numbers. 40 acres. Recording fee. Paid. Then, lower down, another line, thinner and darker, entered after the first ink had aged. Supplemental fee unpaid. Property subject to county claim. That line was not there when Isaac brought it home, Hattie whispered. Elspeth leaned closer. The added words sat too neatly between older sentences, cramped but careful. At the bottom, beside the court seal, the paper had puckered as though pressed twice. The circular mark looked official, yet something in it was wrong. She fetched a recent tax notice from the shelf and held both papers by the window. The new seal on the tax notice showed a clean star above the word county. Hattie's deed showed the same star, but its left point was broken and flattened, the exact way the blue wax in Elspeth's apron was broken. Martha rose under the table, suddenly alert. Outside, wagon wheels creaked to a stop beyond the washyard fence. Through the hanging sheets, Elspeth saw Jonah Teague's broad shape on the driver's bench, his hat pulled low, a sealed wooden crate beside him marked for courthouse storage. He was staring straight at her door. Jonah Teague did not climb down from the wagon at once. He sat behind the hanging sheets with both hands on the reins, his hat brim low. The new pine crate beside him marked courthouse storage old records. The label should have made it harmless. But the rope around the crate was rubbed dark with old wax, and Martha did not hiss at Jonah. She hissed at the rope. Hattie Crowell stepped back from the window. "I should not have brought the deed. You brought what was yours," Elspeth said, though her hand had already closed tighter around it. Jonah came to the gate, but did not open it. One shoulder dipped lower than the other, an old hauling injury made visible in every step. "Judge sent word," he said. "Mrs. Crowell is to return to court if she means to contest the sale." Hattie went pale. "I did not tell him I was here." Jonah looked at the deed in Elspeth's hand. "You did not have to." Elspeth folded the paper and gave it back to Hattie. "Did he send you to fetch her, or to see what she showed me?" "I carry what I'm paid to carry," Jonah said. "I don't read court business." "But you carried court business in April of '74. His eyes lifted then, quick and hard. "That is 12 years gone. So is my sister." The word struck him not like an accusation, but like a sound he had spent years pretending he never heard. He glanced toward Martha, then toward the ledger half hidden near the stove. "You best leave April of '74 buried, Mrs. Rayner." "Buried where?" Jonah turned toward the wagon. "I did not come to talk." Martha lunged before Elspeth could catch her. She did not reach Jonah, but her beak hooked the loose end of rope on the crate and yanked. The lid shifted. Jonah cursed and shoved it down, but not before Elspeth saw a corner of folded cloth inside, tied with blue tape. "Laundry rags," Jonah said too quickly, "for cleaning shelves. Since when does courthouse storage send laundry rags through my yard without asking me to wash them?" He had no answer. That was the first honest thing about him. Marshal Braddock arrived through the side lane, not Main Street. The look he gave Jonah said he had followed the wagon. "Judge Fenro asked me to make certain Mrs. Kroll returned for the hearing. I was doing the same," Jonah said. "No," Braddock replied. "You were delivering a crate to storage." Jonah's mouth tightened. "Then maybe you ought to ask why the judge wants old records moved before the carpenter looks at that step." The marshal went still. Elspeth saw the change because she had spent her life watching small changes in men who could decide whether she was paid. "Where's the crate going?" Braddock asked. Jonah looked toward the courthouse roof above the wash lines. "Back room." Martha pressed forward, beak clicking. Braddock glanced at Elspeth, then at Hattie. "Mrs. Crowell, Go home by the creek path. Do not return to court until I send for you. Mrs. Rayner, bring your ledger." Jonah gave a short, bitter laugh. "You will get yourself removed, Cale." "Maybe," Braddock said. "But if court records are being shifted after a public question, I mean to know which shelf they leave." They went by the side lanes, Jonah driving ahead, and Elspeth carrying Martha under one arm, the ledger tucked beneath the other. The goose was hot and restless against her ribs. Every few steps, Martha kicked weakly toward the wagon, toward the crate, toward the blue tape Elspeth had seen. By the time they reached the courthouse service yard, the afternoon heat had turned the stone walls sour with the smell of dust, horse sweat, ink, and old paper. The back entrance remained locked, but the side storage door stood open. Silas Broom waited inside with a ring of keys trembling in his hand. When he saw Elspeth, his face drained. "She cannot come in." Braddock stepped past him. "She can stand where I stand. The judge will not permit it." "The judge is hearing Mrs. Crowell's sale," Braddock said. "Unless he has two bodies, he is busy." Silas looked at Jonah. It was not the glance of partners dividing guilt. It was the glance of frightened men who had shared the same silence too long. The storage room was narrow and dim, with shelves rising to the ceiling, and old boxes labeled tax notices, marriage bonds, land fees, road claims. Dust covered most of them, yet the center table had been wiped clean that morning. 3 empty spaces marked the shelves where boxes had recently been taken down. Elspeth set Martha on the floor. The old goose landed carefully, favoring her crooked foot, then waddled to the table and pecked once at a smear of blue wax on the plank. Silas made a small sound. Elspeth turned. "You know that wax. Sealing wax is common in a courthouse. Not on a table cleaned this morning." Braddock picked up a loose box label from the floor. "Land Register, 1873 to 1875. His voice dropped. "Where is the box?" "Move for repair," Silas said. "What kind of repair does a register need?" The binding was loose. "Show it." Silas looked toward the door, waiting for Fenro's shadow. When it did not come, he unlocked a rear cabinet and drew out a heavy leather register. Braddock opened it on the table. Names crossed the pages in columns. Crowell, Beams, Lark, Henshaw, Voss. Recording fees, transfer dates, court confirmations. Some entries had clean old ink. Others carried numbers squeezed into margins by a thinner hand. Elspeth found Hattie's name. The first fee line read paid. Above it, someone had added supplemental due in cramped script. "Who made that addition?" Braddock asked. Silas rubbed his ink rag between both hands. "I cannot say. Cannot or will not." Before he could answer, Jonah reached over and turned 2 pages forward. "Ask him where the April loose sheet is." Silas recoiled. "You know nothing about records." "I know what I carried." Braddock caught Jonah's wrist. "What did you carry?" Jonah stared at the register, as if the leather itself had accused him. "A locked dispatch box. Night of the 17th of April, 1874. From the back room to the judge's house. Then back here before dawn. Fenro paid me $2 silver and called it a clerk's error. Nell Rayner was standing by the back door when I came for it. She had wax on her sleeve and a goose under her shawl." Elspeth gripped the table. "You saw her alive?" "I saw her alive," Jonah said. "And I saw Silas take a loose sheet from the register and hide it under his coat." Silas staggered. "The judge said it was misfiled." "You burned it," Jonah said. "I burned a copy." That changed the room. Braddock released Jonah slowly. "Where is the original?" Silas closed his eyes. There was no original left after that night. Martha moved beneath the table, ignored by everyone except Elspeth. Her beak tapped the underside of a drawer, soft but insistent. Elspeth knelt and saw a clean dust line where it had been opened recently. Silas lunged too late. Braddock caught his sleeve. Elspeth pulled the drawer out and found pens, sand, broken wax wafers, and one folded scrap tucked behind the ink block. The scrap was only a torn corner, browned at the edge. It carried 3 clerk's lines and 1 line in Nell's small hand. The first line read the 17th of April, 1874. The second named a transfer seal. The third had been torn away, leaving only N. Rayner delivery witness. Beneath it, in faded laundry ink, Nell had written 2 words that made Martha lower her breast to the floor and fall silent. Back seal. Back seal meant nothing to Elspeth at first. It sounded like one more courthouse phrase made to keep plain people outside its meaning. But Silas Broom looked at the torn scrap as if the two words had stepped from a grave. And Jonah Teague took one slow step away from the table. Martha stayed pressed low to the floor, her wings tucked tight, her crooked foot drawn under her body. She was not hissing now. She was waiting. Marshal Braddock shut the storage room door with his boot. "Explain it." Silas rubbed both hands over his face. Ink stained the lines around his mouth, making him look older than he had that morning. "There was the public seal," he said. "The one used at the front desk, recorded, logged, kept in the clerk's drawer. And there was the old transfer seal, heavier, from before Judge Fenro took the bench. It made a deeper impression. We called it the back seal, because it was kept in the back room for land transfers that needed reviewing before entry." "Reviewing by whom?" Braddock asked. Silas did not answer. Elspeth did. "By Fenro." Jonah looked toward the door. "Careful. I have been careful for 12 years, Elspeth said, and heard how tired the words were. "It did not bring Nell home." Silas stared at the scrap. "Your sister was never meant to see that sheet. She came through the back entrance with linens after dark. There had been a spill in chambers, blue wax on the desk, seal press open, register loose on the table. Judge Fenro told her to leave the bundle and go. She did not. Nell had sharp eyes for small wrong things." Elspeth almost smiled because that was true. Nell could spot a missing collar pin in a basket of 30 shirts. She could tell which clerk had wiped ink on a cuff and which lawyer had lied about a burn mark. Poor women, survived by noticing what clean men believed beneath notice. "What did she see?" Braddock asked. Silas swallowed. A deed entry changed after payment. Isaac Crowell's North Pasture was one. There were others. The first line showed the fee paid. The later line made the fee unpaid, then subject to county claim. Once the judge confirmed it, the land could be sold for costs. Hattie's name seemed to tremble in the open register, though she was no longer in the room. Elspeth turned the pages carefully, following marks that now looked less like clerical mess and more like a trail. Crowell, Beams, Lark, Henshaw, Voss, Ketter, Dooley, Marin. All small holdings, never the big ranches, never a man rich enough to hire counsel. Beside each was a cramped addition, a later fee, a delayed confirmation, a line that shifted land from family grief into county hands. 11 names by Elspeth's count before her throat tightened. Jonah leaned over the register. "I hauled notices to 4 of those farms." "You hauled more than notices," Silas said quietly. Jonah's face hardened, but shame broke through it. "I hauled boxes. I did not know what was inside." "You knew enough to stop asking after the second silver dollar." The drayman did not deny it. That made him look less guilty and more human, which was somehow harder for Elspeth to bear. A villain would have been easier. A villain could be named, struck, hated cleanly. But this room held men who had looked away in pieces, until the looking away became a wall. Braddock pointed to the torn scrap. "If Nell was a delivery witness, why is her name on a transfer sheet?" Silas lowered his voice further. Fenro needed a witness line filled after the fact. Someone had to have been present when the back seal was used. I told him no clerk would sign. He said the laundry girl had seen enough to serve, and too little standing to matter. He wrote N. Rayner, not her full name, just enough to make the file appear witnessed if anyone asked. Elspeth felt the storage room tilt. For 12 years, town pity had made Nell small. Sickly girl. Careless girl. Poor girl who vanished because poor girls were always near the edge of vanishing. Now, even her name had been used as a tool, half written into a lie, because the court believed she would not count. Elspeth remembered how many nights she had cursed herself for scolding Nell over lost laundry, never knowing her sister had been carrying the town's stolen acres in her pocket. The shame in her chest changed shape. It was no longer only grief, but the knowledge that Nell had been brave when Elspeth had thought her frightened. "What did Nell do?" Elspeth asked. Silas's eyes filled. "She came back the next morning, before sunrise. She had Martha under her shawl because the goose would not stay behind. She asked me why Isaac Crowell's deed said unpaid when she had heard the judge say paid the night before. I told her to forget it. She said poor people do not get to forget what rich men write down. Then she took the scrap." Jonah exhaled through his nose. "That was when Fenro sent me for the dispatch box." Silas nodded. He said the back seal had gone missing and that Nell had stolen it. He said if the seal was not recovered, Every transfer in the county could be questioned. I believed him for almost an hour. For almost an hour? Braddock asked. Silas looked at Elspeth. Because I found a note after she left. She tucked it in the blotter. It said she had not stolen the seal to sell it. She had taken it so it could not be used again. Elspeth gripped the edge of the table until pain rose into her fingers. Martha lifted her head at the change in her breathing. Where is that note? Elspeth asked. Gone, Silas said. Fenro took the blotter. I never saw the note again. It was not enough. The room seemed full of almost proof, almost courage, almost a witness who had lived long enough to speak. Elspeth wanted to hate Silas, and some part of her did. But the old clerk looked as if hatred had already eaten him thin. The front bell rang once from the courtroom. Court resuming. Braddock moved to the window and looked through the dusty glass. Fenro is ending the sale early. Jonah cursed under his breath. Then he knows. Before anyone moved, footsteps crossed the outer hall. Silas snatched the scrap from the table by reflex, then froze when Martha rose with a rasping hiss. The goose staggered, nearly fell, and beat one wing against the floor for balance. Elspeth caught her before she could throw herself toward the door. The old body in her arms shook with effort, and the cloudy eye fixed not on the hallway, but on the register still open to the list of names. Braddock opened the door a crack. A courthouse boy stood there, breathing hard. Judge says the storage room is to be locked. All unauthorized persons out. Who is authorized? Braddock asked. The judge, Mr. Broom, and Mr. Teague for moving records. Jonah gave a humorless smile. Convenient. The boy held out another folded paper. And Mrs. Rayner is ordered to appear in the courtroom for disturbing county proceedings and withholding property found on county grounds. Elspeth took the paper. The order bore the current court seal, clean and sharp. No broken star, no flattened edge. She slid it beside Hattie's deed in her mind, and saw the difference as clearly as two mismatched buttons. Braddock said, You do not have to walk into that room alone. Yes, Elspeth said. I do. Silas looked startled. Mrs. Rayner, he will turn this on Nell. He already did. She placed the torn scrap inside her ledger, between April 14 and April 17, where Nell's last marks waited. Then she tucked the ledger beneath her arm and held Martha close, feeling the goose's breath rattle against her sleeve. At the door, Martha twisted her neck toward the register and gave one weak peck at the open page. Elspeth looked down. In the margin beside Hattie Crowell's name, partly hidden under the added feline, was a tiny stitch mark in dark ink. Nell's mark. The same 3 stitches from the laundry tape. Elspeth turned one page, then another. The mark appeared again beside Beams, then Lark, then Voss. 11 times in all. Nell had not marked one lie. She had marked every family Fenro stole from. The courtroom smelled of sun-warmed pine, ink, and bodies pretending not to sweat. By the time Elspeth stepped through the rear aisle with Martha under one arm and the ledger beneath the other, Judge Fenro had already taken his bench. He sat high above the room with the afternoon light behind him, turning his silver hair bright enough that his face seemed carved from shade. Hattie Crowell stood near the front rail, hands folded over her deed, while Reverend Lyle waited beside her as if comfort and control had learned to wear the same coat. Fenro looked at Elspeth, then at Martha, and let the silence lengthen until every bench understood who had brought disorder inside. Mrs. Rayner, he said, you have been ordered here because property belonging to the county was removed from courthouse grounds, and because an animal under your keeping has interfered with public proceedings. Martha shifted in Elspeth's arms. The old goose's breath rattled softly, and her cloudy eye closed halfway, not in sleep but in strain. Elspeth felt how tired she was. Anger could carry Martha across 3 streets. Memory could drive her beak into wood. But age and pain had their own law, and that law was never moved by courage. I found what was hidden, Elspeth said. Fenro's mouth softened in a way that made several people lean toward him. You found scraps near an old door. You have made them into accusations because grief has asked you for an answer all these years. My sister's name is on one of those scraps. Your sister's name, Fenro replied, is precisely the difficulty. A murmur moved across the benches. Braddock stood near the side wall, hat in hand, jaw set. Jonah waited by the rear door, his eyes low. Silas Broom had taken his clerk's place below the bench, but his hands would not stay still. Elspeth saw all 3 men, and understood that fear could fill a courthouse without making a sound. Fenro nodded to Silas. Read the replacement notice from May of 1874. Silas opened a thin file. His voice began dry and low, then steadied in the old habit of reading what powerful men placed before him. On the 3rd day of May, County Transfer Seal reported missing from rear records room. Temporary suspension of certain land confirmations lifted upon replacement. Suspected unauthorized handling by delivery personnel during service hours. Delivery personnel, Fenro said, looking at Elspeth with sorrow polished smooth. The court did not press the matter against your family because your sister was gone, and because mercy seemed better than scandal. The room shifted again. Elspeth felt it turn against Nell, not all at once, but with the old relief people felt when a dead poor girl could carry blame no living official wanted. Reverend Lyle lowered his head. Mercy often leaves no record, he murmured. Elspeth opened her ledger to April 17 and held it against her chest. Nell did not steal that seal to sell it. She took it because it was being used. Fenro's eyes sharpened. Used by whom? The question was a trap laid in plain sight. If she said his name without proof, he would make the room hear only slander. If she did not, he would make them hear uncertainty. Elspeth looked down at Martha, at the dull feathers along the old neck, at the beak that had pulled truth from wood because no human hand had dared. Used on records that changed paid land into unpaid land, she said. Hattie Crowell lifted her deed. My husband's fee was marked paid before it was marked due. Fenro turned to her kindly. Mrs. Crowell, you are grieving a husband and facing the loss of property. I will not let others exploit your distress. You signed the sale notice, Hattie said. I signed what the record required. Braddock stepped forward. Judge, the register shows later additions beside more than one family name. Fenro looked at the marshal as though disappointed in a student. And you are trained in handwriting examination now? No. Land law? No. Then be careful how far you walk from your badge, Marshal. That quiet warning did more than a shout would have. Braddock stopped, and the benches saw him stop. Elspeth felt the room learning its lesson. Even the marshal could be made smaller under the bench. Fenro then lifted a second paper, already prepared. There is also the matter of the animal. A courthouse is not a yard pen. I have here an order declaring the goose a public nuisance, subject to seizure if it again disrupts proceedings or damages county property. Martha stirred as if she knew when paper spoke against her. Elspeth tightened her arm around the warm, shaking body. She is old. She is dangerous, Fenro said. She has bitten a deputy, damaged a threshold, and frightened citizens. She found what you buried. A hard silence followed. It was the first careless thing Elspeth had said, and Fenro caught it with both hands. What I buried? He asked softly. Reverend Lyle rose. Mrs. Rayner, anger at authority will not resurrect the dead. No, Elspeth said, but lies can keep them from resting. A woman near the rear whispered amen before she remembered where she sat. Hattie took one step away from Reverend Lyle. It was not much, but Elspeth saw it. So did Fenro. His face remained calm, yet the room tightened around him. Mr. Broom, he said, did you personally witness Judge Fenro alter any deed? Silas went pale. He looked at Elspeth, then at Jonah, then at the register on his desk. No, sir. Did you personally witness him instruct anyone to forge a record? Silas's throat worked. No, sir. Did Mrs. Rayner's sister remove the transfer seal from the back room without authorization? The clerk closed his eyes. I was told she had. Fenro let the answer hang as if it were complete. The crowd needed only a small bridge to cross back into obedience, and he had given them one. Elspeth felt the ledger in her hands become lighter, almost foolish. A washerwoman's book, a widow's deed, a torn scrap, a goose too tired to hold up her head. Against a judge, they looked like things that could be swept into a drawer. For one breath, Elspeth nearly let them be forgotten. She saw the washyard, the broken kettle, the rent notice, Martha sleeping in shade if she lived through the walk home. She saw Nell as the town wanted her, a sad girl, gone too long to defend. Then Martha jerked. The motion tore a weak sound from the old goose's throat. She twisted in Elspeth's arms with sudden force, not toward the bench, not toward Fenro, but toward the side passage behind the clerk's desk. Her beak opened and closed around the air. Elspeth smelled it then, faint beneath ink and floor dust. Old wax warmed by afternoon heat. Silas smelled it too. His eyes flew to the narrow hall. Fenro saw both of them. Remove that animal. The deputy started forward. Martha kicked once, painfully. and Elspeth turned her body to shield her. Braddock moved at the same time, putting himself between the deputy and the aisle. "Hold. Marshal," Fenro said. "You are testing my patience." "No," Braddock answered, though his voice was tight. "I am preserving order." Martha's beak pointed toward the side passage again. On the wall beyond Silas's desk, half hidden behind a coat rack and old election boards, Elspeth saw a door she had never noticed from the public benches. Its paint had been covered with courthouse gray, but under the flaking edge she could make out two faded words: Scale Room. Jonah stared at the door, as if it had opened in his memory. That room was sealed after 74. Silas whispered. It was never sealed, only renamed. Fenro stood so quickly his chair struck the wall behind him. The sound cracked through the courtroom, and at last the judge's calm broke enough for everyone to hear the man beneath it. "This hearing is adjourned." But Martha had already slipped from Elspeth's arms. She hit the floor badly, stumbled, and dragged herself toward the side passage, with one wing low for balance. Each step cost her. Each breath scraped. Yet she kept moving, past Silas's desk, past Braddock's boots, straight to the gray-painted door. At the threshold of the scale room, the old goose lowered her beak and tapped the floorboards 3 times. The sound that came back was not wood. It was metal under dust. The sound from beneath the scale room boards changed the room more than any accusation had. People who had spent all afternoon doubting Elspeth now leaned toward the side passage, because metal hidden under a courthouse floor was harder to dismiss than grief. Judge Fenro came down from the bench with his robe gathered in one hand and his cane in the other, moving fast enough that the room saw fear before he dressed it as authority. "Marshal Braddock," he said, "remove everyone from that room. This hearing is adjourned, and no county floor will be pried open before a mob." Braddock stood between Fenro and the narrow door. "No one has named a mob. I have named disorder. That is enough." Elspeth knelt beside Martha. The old goose had lowered herself against the threshold, breast pressed to dusty wood, cloudy eye half shut. Her beak rested over the same board she had tapped. The effort of crossing the courtroom had emptied her. Each breath clicked softly in her throat, and one wing trembled at her side. Elspeth slid a hand beneath the warm feathers and whispered, "You have done enough." Martha answered by tapping the board once more, weaker this time. Silas Broom stepped into the scale room, as if entering a place he had promised never to remember. It was smaller than Elspeth expected, hardly more than a storage closet with a high window, a rusted hanging scale, 2 cracked shelves, and a counter worn smooth by years of bundles being weighed and signed for. Under the dust, the floorboards showed old square marks where something heavy had once stood. In one corner lay a broken brass weight, green at the edges. Jonah stared at the hanging scale. This is where they checked delivery weights before the back room took records. Coal oil, paper, linens, sealed boxes. "And dispatch boxes," Braddock said. Jonah did not look away. "Yes." Fenro remained outside the doorway, close enough to command, but not close enough to touch the floor Martha had marked. "Mr. Broom, lock this room." Silas held the keys, but his fingers would not choose one. "Your Honor, if there is county property beneath the boards, it should be entered into record, by proper process." Braddock drew his pocket knife and knelt. "Then we will begin by seeing whether the board is loose." Fenro's voice hardened. "If you lift that board without written authorization, I will suspend you before sundown." The marshal paused. That pause nearly ended it. Elspeth saw the badge weighing against the man beneath it, saw the old habit of obeying the bench tighten his shoulders. Then Hattie Kroll stepped from the hall and placed her deed on the scale room counter. "My 40 acres were taken by written authorization." Another voice followed from behind her. "So were my brother's 12. The speaker was a thin man Elspeth knew as Caleb Beams, a wheelwright with one bad hand. Behind him stood Mrs. Voss from the shuttered newspaper office, small and stern in a black hat gone shiny with age. She carried a notebook against her chest, and her eyes had already measured every face in the passage. Fenro saw her and went still. "Miss Voss, this is not a newspaper matter." "Then it will be easy to write nothing," Della Voss said. "But I have a column space empty and a telegraph boy who owes me 2 favors." That was the second time that afternoon Elspeth saw the judge calculate in public. He recovered quickly. "Print slander, and you will answer for it." "I have answered for worse than silence," Della said. "I am tired of that one." Braddock slid the knife tip beneath the board Martha marked. The plank lifted less than an inch, enough for dust to spill dark through the seam. Jonah stepped forward and held out a small pry bar from his wagon belt. "For crate lids," he said. Fenro pointed his cane at him. "Mr. Teague, you are admitting to tampering with evidence." "I am admitting I own a pry bar." Braddock took it. The board came up with a dry groan. Under it lay packed dust, a strip of oilcloth, and the square edge of a tin box wedged between joists. It was no larger than a bread pan, wrapped twice in blackened cloth, and sealed with a line of blue wax along the lid. Martha lifted her head when the smell reached her. For a moment the cloudy eye cleared with recognition so sharp that Elspeth had to look away. "No one touches that," Fenro said. Braddock lifted the box anyway and set it on the counter. "Then everyone sees it." The wax line bore a broken star, the same flattened left point as Hattie's deed, the same rim as the lump in Elspeth's apron. Silas made a sound that might have been a prayer. Della Voss opened her notebook. The lid resisted until Jonah cut the old cloth binding. Inside lay a heavy brass seal press, darker than the new one on Silas's desk, its handle wrapped in cracked leather. Beside it were 3 folded register pages, a stack of draft deeds, and a narrow strip of linen stitched with Nell's 3 dark marks. Elspeth touched the linen first, not the seal, not the papers. The linen. Her sister's hand had passed through this box before any court officer dared admit it existed. Silas unfolded the top register page with shaking care. "Crowell," he whispered. "Original fee paid. No supplemental due." He lifted the second page. "Beams, paid." The third. "Voss transfer held, then released. No county claim." Caleb Beams made a broken sound behind Della. Hattie pressed both hands over her mouth. The room seemed to widen around the names, making space for people who had been treated as errors in a book. Braddock picked up one draft deed. "These are not signed." Silas nodded slowly. "Drafts prepared before the public filings. The changes were planned before the hearings." "By whom?" Fenro asked from the doorway too quickly. Della looked up. "That is the question you should not have asked so fast." Fenro ignored her and stepped into the room at last. "This proves nothing except that stolen county property was concealed by a delivery girl, and perhaps by others trying to profit from confusion. A missing seal hidden under the floor with altered papers harms the integrity of every record in this county. It does not identify the hand that hid it." Elspeth felt the room wobble again. He was doing it. Even with the box open, even with Nell's marks, he was turning proof into fog. Silas looked ready to fold. Jonah's jaw worked, but no words came. Braddock held the deed draft, trapped between law and certainty. Martha moved before anyone else did. She dragged herself toward the brass seal press and pecked at the leather-wrapped handle. Once. Then again, a strip of old leather flaked loose, revealing initials scratched into the brass beneath. AF. No one mistook them. Fenro's face lost color only for a moment, but Della saw it, and so did the families crowding the passage. The judge reached for the seal press. Braddock caught his wrist. "County property," Fenro said coldly. "Evidence," Braddock answered. Della tore a page from her notebook and handed it to the telegraph boy, who had appeared at her elbow as if summoned by stubbornness alone. "Take this to the station. Territorial Land Office, Santa Verity. Message for Examiner Edwin Shaw. Tell him Absolution Creek has old seal misuse, altered deed drafts, and 11 contested family records. Send it now." The boy ran before Fenro could speak. The judge watched him go, then slowly turned back to the room. His calm returned, but it was no longer smooth. It had edges. "Very well," he said. "Since Mrs. Rayner and her companions insist on spectacle, we will have one. An emergency public review will convene in this courtroom within the hour. Every paper, every witness, and every accusation will be heard before this town, before rumor outruns law." Della closed her notebook. "Before Examiner Shaw arrives, you mean?" Fenro smiled. "If your evidence is truth, Miss Voss, it should survive the room." Elspeth looked down at Martha. The goose had collapsed beside the open box, her breath thin but steady, one tired wing touching Nell's linen strip. Elspeth understood then that finding the truth was not the same as keeping it. The harder part was about to begin. The emergency review began before the dust had settled on the scale room floor. Judge Fenro ordered the benches filled, the doors opened, and the evidence placed on the clerk's table as if arranging it himself could return it to his control. The brass-back seal sat beside the tin box, the torn register pages, Hattie Crowell's deed, Elspeth's laundry ledger, and Nell's linen strip. Martha lay in Elspeth's lap near the front rail, too spent to stand, her cloudy eye half closed, and her old foot tucked beneath her body. Fenro did not sit at first. He stood before the bench like a man addressing a church. "This town deserves order," he said. "It deserves law unspoiled by panic, gossip, and personal grief. What has been found today may prove theft, yes. It may prove that county property was hidden, but hidden property does not prove who hid it, why it was hidden, or whether any present accusation is true." He pointed to the old seal. This transfer seal was reported missing in May of 1874. The most likely explanation remains the same one recorded then. A delivery girl with access to the rear rooms handled what was not hers. Elspeth felt Martha stir at the sound of Nell being made small again. She rose carefully, holding the goose against her. "My sister did handle what was not hers," she said. "She handled it because men trusted by this town were using it to take what was not theirs." Fenro's eyes narrowed. "You will not slander the dead by putting crimes in their hands and then call it loyalty. I am not putting crimes in Nell's hands. You did that when you wrote her name as witness without her consent." Silas Broom flinched. Fenro saw it and moved at once. "Mr. Broom, you have served this county for 31 years. Tell this room whether you saw me write that witness line." Silas stood with both hands on the clerk's desk. His lips moved before sound came. "No." Fenro turned slightly, allowing the answer to travel until uncertainty settled over the benches. Braddock stepped forward. "Ask him if he saw the changed records." Fenro struck the floor once with his cane. "You do not conduct this court, Marshal." "No," Braddock said. "But I can ask a citizen a question in a public room." The benches murmured. Delavos had taken a place near the aisle, pencil moving across her notebook. Hattie Crowell stood beside Caleb Beams and 3 other families whose names Elspeth had seen in the register margins. They looked frightened, but they had come. Silas drew one breath, then another. "I did not see Judge Fenro write Nell's name," he said. "I saw the line afterward. I saw the back seal used after regular hours. I saw paid entries become unpaid entries. I was told the changes corrected errors. I believed that until Nell asked why poor men's mistakes always gave land to the county." The room shifted. Fenro's face remained composed, but a pulse beat at his temple. Jonah Teague was called next. Fenro made sure of it. "Mr. Teague," he said, "you transported the dispatch box, received silver, and had access to the back room. Is that correct?" Jonah looked at the floor. "Yes." "Then perhaps this room should ask whether a drayman, not a judge, found profit in moving records." Jonah lifted his head. "I carried what you told me to carry. I took your $2 and kept my mouth shut because I was a coward. But I never owned a seal press with AF scratched under the handle." Braddock unwrapped the leather from the brass handle and held the initials toward the room. Fenro gave a thin smile. "Initials can be scratched by anyone," Delavos said. "Before today, no one outside this courthouse knew the handle was wrapped." A small sound moved through the benches, not loud enough to be victory, but enough to weaken obedience. Hattie Crowell unfolded her deed with trembling hands. "My Isaac paid his fee. The original page says he paid. The later line says he did not. That later line gave the county claim to our north pasture." Caleb Beams lifted his brother's copy. Same hand added mine. Mrs. Lark, who had not spoken all day, rose from the second bench. "My husband died thinking he had failed us. He had not failed us." One by one, not with drama, but with the tired steadiness of people who had carried shame too long, the families named their acres. 40 from Kroll, 12 from Beams, 20 from Lark, 32 from Voss. Small pieces by rich men's measure, whole futures by poor people's. Fenro tried again, this time with the cold shape of law. Even if clerical irregularities occurred, they do not prove intent. Land abandoned through unpaid fees lawfully returns to county handling. Elspeth opened her ledger to Nell's last marked week and placed it beside the register pages. Nell marked every family before any of them knew to complain. She marked them with the same 3 stitches she used when courthouse bundles came back missing a piece. She knew something had been taken from each record. Silas added, voice shaking but clear now. The draft deeds in the tin box were prepared before the public hearings. The added fees were planned before the families were told they owed them. Braddock held up the drafts. And the seal impressions matched the broken star on the old back seal, not the current seal. For the first time, Fenro reached for the evidence himself. His hand closed around the old seal press. but Braddock caught his wrist before he could lift it. "Do not," the marshal said. Fenro's calm cracked. "That is county property." Delavos answered before Braddock could. "It is evidence of county theft." The doors opened at the rear. A travel-worn man entered with the telegraph boy behind him, dust on his coat and a leather case in one hand. Della stood. Examiner Shaw. Edwin Shaw did not stride in like salvation. He looked tired, official, and deeply unwilling to be impressed by a judge's posture. "I received a wire concerning seal misuse and contested land records," he said. "I am here to observe and secure documents, not to decide what this room has not yet proved." Fenro seized on that. "Then you admit nothing is proved?" Shaw looked at the table. "I admit the people here have done the work the county should have done." He examined the broken seal impression, the initials, the draft deeds, the register pages, and the old notice Silas produced from the May file. When he reached Nell's linen strip, he paused. "Who preserved the chain?" Elspeth looked down at Martha. The goose had opened her cloudy eye, not proudly, not like a miracle, only like an old creature who had finally heard the right question. "She did," Elspeth said, "and my sister began it." Shaw closed the tin box. "Then these records are secured under territorial authority. Judge Fenro, pending investigation. You are removed from handling land matters in this county. Marshal, you will hold the seal, drafts, and altered pages. Mr. Broom, you will provide sworn testimony. Miss Voss, your notes may be requested." Fenro looked around the room for the old obedience and found families instead. Hattie Crowell did not lower her eyes. Jonah did not step back. Silas did not sit down. The judge's hand loosened from his cane, and with that small motion, Absolution Creek understood that the bench had not made him tall. It had only hidden how much he needed people to kneel before it. The final orders took weeks. Land was not restored in a single afternoon, and the dead did not rise because a seal was locked away. Some families regained acres. Some received money from sales that could not be undone. By autumn, a territorial court stripped Fenro of his bench and indicted him for falsifying land records. His name was removed from the courthouse door before the first frost. Reverend Lyle preached about humility without once naming the man whose donations had polished his pew. Jonah Teague gave testimony and spent the rest of his life hauling courthouse crates in daylight only. Silas Broom lost his clerkship, but kept enough courage to sign every page he had once feared to touch. On the first cool morning after the hearing, Elspeth walked back to the wash yard by Mercy Creek. She carried no court paper in her hands. Only Nell's linen strip, washed clean at last, with 3 dark stitches still visible at the end. Martha followed slowly, refusing to be carried until the last few steps. Her crooked foot dragged through the dust, and her breath still caught when the road rose. But she made it to the old willow post where Nell had tied the first wash line. Elspeth fastened the linen strip there, not as proof now, but as remembrance. The cloth lifted in the creek wind, small and stubborn against the morning light. Martha settled beneath it, folding herself into the shade with a tired sigh. She did not look toward the courthouse. She did not scrape at any door. For the first time in 12 years, the old goose had no locked place left to answer. Elspeth stood beside her until the kettles began to steam and the town bells rang over Absolution Creek. Justice had not brought Nell back. It had not returned every acre exactly as it had been. But it had taken her name out of the lie, and sometimes, for the forgotten, that was the first grave marker worth having.